Good evening and welcome to the first event of the American Academy of 2019. I'm Terry McCarthy. I run the Academy and delighted to see you all here. We're particularly happy to have someone whom I think is quite fairly described as one of our most prominent public intellectuals in the United States these days, Timothy Snyder. His last two books, Road to Unfreedom and then On Tyranny, suggests not a comedy routine, but something a little bit more serious. And he'll be talking about that later. But first, let me welcome some special folks, starting with Intelligence Squared Germany, who are our partners tonight. We couldn't have done it without them. Melissa Schneider-Sickert, thank you so much. Amelie von Wedel and Elisa Apperly, thank you so much for helping us to set up this event. Big warm welcome to Hans-Michael Gies and his wife Almut, our trustees who are here, trustee who's here tonight. And we also have a couple of our fellows who have already arrived for next semester, Fred Donner and Jared Farmer. So we're delighted that they're here. And we, of course, will be having our fellows presentation on January 29th. And after that, our program. So keep your eyes on our program to see which ones you would like to come to. We have a couple of other special guests here. Wolfgang Tillmans is here, the artist, and Karl Schlögl, the historian. Thank you so much for coming, that you could come again. We're delighted. We will be happy to have Tim's books for sale afterwards. They're outside in the lobby, and Tim will happily sign those books for you. We're going to have he will give a talk, and then we'll have some Q&A afterwards. But first, I'm going to ask Melissa to come and introduce Tim.
Thank you, Terry. So I'm Melissa Schneider-Sickert. I'm the Director of Intelligence Squared Germany. Intelligence Squared is an Oxford-style debating and discussion forum that was established in London in 2002. And it stages some of the most stimulating debates on the hottest topics with some of the best speakers in the world. James Comey, Malala Yousafzai, Mikhail Khodorkovsky, Ronan Farrow, to name just a few. Intelligence Squared debates bring together eminent experts with opposite points of view and put forward reasoned, learned arguments to state their case. Our aim is to promote a deeper understanding on the most pressing topics of our times in an entertaining and engaging format. All of the events are available in our podcast, which has over 500,000 monthly plays and downloads, as well as 16 million YouTube views. If you'd like to stay in touch and hear more about our Berlin events and podcasts, please do sign up on our mailing list, which will be at the reception after the lecture. I'd particularly like to thank Terry McCarthy and the great team at the American Academy for their cooperation with organising and hosting the event this evening. They've really pulled out all the stops and got a great, efficient, so thank you. It's been a real pleasure for us. Intelligence Squared has, over the last 15 years, through these debates and discussions, championed both oration and the power of language, and has promoted an understanding of how language in all its forms can be used to convince, persuade, enlighten, and understand. In line with our topic for this evening, I'd like to briefly mention one example of the political corruption of language. Salman Rushdie wrote an article back in 2006, 5 years into the presidency of George W. Bush and deep into the murky waters of the US government's facilitation of torture. A particular phrase came into usage at that time, extraordinary rendition. We all now know this to mean an extrajudicial, covert kidnap and delivery of an individual for interrogation to an unspecified country where torture is permitted. A meaning which even Donald Rumsfeld would have to agree has actually nothing to do with the dictionary definition of either of the two words in question. Despite its clear contravention of the rule of law, the euphemism shows how language can be used both to obscure and normalise the real meaning of the act, and after endless repetition by the media, is then accepted in both form and deed into regular usage. Tonight, we're honoured to hear more about the use and abuse of language from leading American historian, Professor Timothy Snyder. Timothy is Professor of History at Yale University, a permanent fellow at the Institute of Human Sciences in Vienna. His book publications include Bloodlands, Black Earth, and The Road to Unfreedom, as well as the political pamphlet On Tyranny, which has been translated into 40 languages. Among his numerous awards, he is recipient of the Hannah Arendt Prize in Political Thought and of state orders from Estonia, Lithuania, and Poland. Tonight, Timothy will address the spread of misinformation and linguistic manipulation by authoritarian regimes and their supporters. And in the words of the Jewish philologist Victor Klemperer, the need for constant vigilance by ordinary citizens. Please welcome Timothy Snyder.
Thank you very much for these kind introductions. Thanks to all of you for being here. Speaking of language, thanks to all of you who are coming to listen to a lecture that is not in your first language. Wir können es auch auf Deutsch tun, aber ich fürchte mich, ich bin weniger interessant auf Deutsch als in English. But I thank you for that. I know what it means to listen to something that's not in your first language. I've been asked to speak on this question of language in neo-fascism. This is a subject which has to do with a present which we are trying to understand ourselves. It's not clear when we talk about politics now just how time works. What are the things that we're seeing that somehow come out of the past or reflect the past or imitate the past? What are the things that are new in the present? And what are the things that are calling out to us from a future, bright or dark, which we've gotten out of the habit of thinking about? So I'm going to take this subject as straightforwardly and simply as I can. And by asking at the beginning what I take to be the most basic of these questions. What is it about fascist and neo-fascist language that we would not like to imitate? So standing in front of you, giving a lecture, or having a discussion with you afterwards, what is the thing that I would most like not to do? What is the thing that I would wish for us most not to do? And the answer for me, the first answer that I can come to, is that we not be unreflective. So I'm going to spend a little while talking about fascism, neo-fascism, and language. It would be very easy to do that on the basis of everything that we do is fine. We use language beautifully. We haven't possibly made any mistakes with language in the last 25 or 30 years that made this more likely. That would be a very easy assumption to proceed from. And I would suspect that if I started out that way, you would probably come along with me, right? Or many of you would come along with me. So I want to start a different way. I want to ask, before I get to the terrible fascists and the terrible neo-fascists who presumably most of us don't like, I want to start with, what have we done with language? What have we done in the last 25 or 30 years which perhaps has made the phenomenon that will be the center of my talk more likely? Let me offer a couple of suggestions. On the left, we've done a couple of things, and I give this to you as a hypothesis. Think about it as I go through the talk. On the left, we've done a couple of things which I think have made neo-fascist or fascist language more likely. The first of these is the discrediting of the idea of attainable, commonsensical social truth. That idea, which did come primarily from the left, has made it easier for people to claim that since there is no truth, all that really matters is emotion. And in that realm, all that is going to matter is the ability on an industrial scale now to manage emotion, a form of politics which has pushed us to the right. Something else that we have done on the left is to diminish the significance of the state, to treat the state as either not important or as always the enemy, the thing to be concerned about, which of course opens the way for a form of quote-unquote libertarianism, which does not criticize huge corporations, but which only criticizes the state. And it also opens the way for a form of right-wing politics in which there is no critique of the corporation, but there is a great deal of an attempt to dismantle the state. On the center, what are some of the things that we have done with language which have made the rise of the far right more likely, more comfortable, less surprising? One of these is to say that there are no alternatives. This is a phrase which has been repeated so many millions of times in the last 25 years, in so many and manifold various contexts, in so many languages of Europe and North America, that it goes beyond being a banality. This is a phrase which we have used to numb ourselves. This is a phrase which we have used to hit ourselves in the head until we ourselves are unable to see the alternatives. Not just the possible alternatives, but the really existing authoritarian alternatives, even as they emerge in the real world. We found ourselves dismissing actual authoritarians with actual right-wing ideologies, for example, Mr. Putin, as pragmatists, as simply people who are following their own interests. That's what happens when you say there are no alternatives. History has come to an end. That's another mainstream position. And of course, if history has come to an end, a number of other things came to an end, like responsibility. Because without history, without the historical sense that many things were possible, and therefore many things will be possible, that time flows forward, and that what the present is a kind of structure, a dam, a canal, a structure in the flow of time from past to present, and that we are that structure. If we say history has come to an end, the flow of time has stopped, then one of the things that goes away is a sense of responsibility. This is what I call in the book the politics of inevitability. For the last 25 years or so in the West, I think the politics of inevitability has been the main way that we have approached and discussed the world. The problem with the politics of inevitability is that it opens the way for something else, which in the book I call the politics of eternity. The politics of inevitability, no alternatives, history is over. The politics of inevitability shrinks our idea of the future into a better version of the present. It tells us that time is like a line moving from here to there, and we know what's going to cause what. The problem with this, aside from the fact that it does away with individual responsibility, the problem with this is that it's just not true. It may seem true to you or me for a while, but it's not going to seem true to people who lose their houses in 2008, or to Russians who lose their savings in 1998, or to Americans who in general now make less money than their parents. It's not going to seem true to different people in different times. This idea is going to break. And when it breaks into the thing that I want to discuss. It breaks into the new mainstream of European and American politics, which I would call the politics of eternity. So from Unausweichlichkeit, we go to Ewigkeit. Politik der Unausweichlichkeit to Politik der Ewigkeit. With eternity, what I mean is the idea that time is no longer a line going into the future. Predictably, time is a cycle. The same thing happens over and over again, and that same thing is we, the innocent, the members of the nation, are under assault, are threatened by penetration by some other. The Chinese, the Mexicans, the Jews, the homosexuals, some other. And the same thing happens over and over again. The politics of eternity takes the idea that the state doesn't need to do anything and turns it into the idea that the state can't do anything. It takes a set of assumptions which says we don't have to think much about the future because we know what's going to happen, and transforms them into how can we think at all about the future because the threat is literally always at the gate. The politics of eternity, though, shares with the politics of inevitability the fundamental trait of being irresponsible. That in societies where we claim that law, freedom, and pluralism matter, we use a discourse, we use a basic trope, which does away with the idea of individual responsibility. So that is how eternity arises from inevitability. The question underneath all of this, of course, and I will address it, is that fascist? Is the politics of eternity fascist? Is it neo-fascist? Is it something else? Now, let me try to be clear about what I mean by the politics of eternity, where we are now. I will take the example of today's politics in the United States, the example of the wall. So, What is the wall? At first glance, the wall is a perfect example of fascist politics in every way. Build that wall is nothing other than a tribal scream. It is literally a call and response with a leader, with a microphone, where people respond. Just in that sense, optically, it is fascism. It is also fascism in the sense, as recommended by Carl Schmitt, that it beautifully begins politics from us and them. Build the wall says we are the ones who have to be protected from them. We need a barrier. So it begins politics not from a social contract, but from a notion of us and them. It is also fascist today in that it's being connected with the idea of a state of exception. So as Carl Schmitt recommended, if you wish to, and as the end of the Weimar Republic reminds us, if you wish to turn a rule of law state into an authoritarian regime, what you need to do is find a way to declare a state of exception, a state of emergency, and then keep that going for as long as possible. So at first glance, build that wall looks like fascism. But it's not just fascism. There's a second element to this. Where did the slogan, build that wall, come from? Did an American think of it? No. Build that wall was tested by a British company, Cambridge Analytica, on the basis of tens of millions of examples of stolen personal data from Facebook. Build that wall was a slogan which was tested out on Americans, not to their knowledge, and which was found to be a very resonant thing in American politics in 2014. Build that wall, in other words, was chosen by the machine. Without the technologies, without the massive psychographic testing, without Facebook's ability to collect huge amounts of personal data, build that wall, that slogan, would not exist in American political reality. There is a sense in which we are all now prisoners of what the algorithms find out irritate us the most. Build that wall is very exciting for many Americans. It's very irritating for other Americans. And in this sense, we are all, this is not fascism, but something different. Build that wall, the discourse, right? The statement, the thing, the phrase, that's it. That's the thing in itself. That's the victory of the machine over us, because I'm going to betray a big secret now. There isn't a wall. Nor will there be a wall. The United States is capable of many things, but actually large infrastructure projects are not among them. So we will not build a wall. But the thing in itself, though, may be the notion of building a wall. And by the way, the things that I'm saying, although Mr. Trump would of course use other language, are things that he understands as well. He doesn't want to build the wall. He wants build the wall to be a slogan he can use indefinitely. But there's another way to look at this phrase, build that wall. And it has to do with responsibility. Who exactly is supposed to build the wall? When the leader says, build that wall, and the response is, build that wall, who are they actually telling to build that wall? Drain the swamp, lock her up, kindred slogans with similar digital origins. Who is supposed to do those things? It's not clear, right? Build that wall is not in the imperative. It's not I'm telling you to build the wall or you're telling me. It's someone should build the wall. I don't know how many of you cook with French cookbooks. But if you cook with French cookbooks, you will have noticed that in French cookbooks, when you're told what to do, add a cup of flour, add a bit of sugar, pinch of cinnamon, they use the subjunctive, right? The subjunctive. It's not clear who is doing it. It's just we know, right? One is going to do this. I would submit to you that that is the grammatical sense in which build that wall is spoken. No one is telling Mr. Trump to build the wall. Deep down, we know that Mr. Trump is not going to be pushing any wheelbarrows. Nobody is telling the Americans to build a wall. It's not clear who really should build the wall. And if you've considered what we've done with the wall so far, remember, whatever might be happening, we are still a big, rich country. Just nod when I say things like that. It makes me feel better. consider what we have done in building the wall in the last 2 years. What have we done? We have set up, okay, how many of you have ever remodeled a kitchen? When you remodel a kitchen, what's the most fun part? It's when you choose your kitchen tiles, right? You go to the store, maybe with the builder, and they're kitchen tiles, right? And this one is gray, and this one is white, and this one has a little pattern on it. That's where we are with the wall. We have a number of private contractors. They have gone to the US-Mexican border, and they have set up what are, in effect, huge kitchen tiles. One is white, one is blue, one is gray, this one is stripy. And our building the wall consists in Mr. Trump every so often going to San Diego, driving in front of the kitchen tiles, and posing in front of the one he thinks looks scary that day, right? So is that fascism? Or is it only fascism? What does it mean when we can't build a wall? What does it mean when it's not clear who is actually supposed to be performing the actions? Because it seems to me that this example that I'm giving you is actually characteristic of a whole lot of things that have happened in the world in the last few years, and not just in my beloved homeland. What does it mean? So what does it mean when you solve a fictional problem of Mexican terrorism with a fictional wall that you're never actually going to build? I think it's somehow in the same genre of phenomenon as Russia invading a neighboring country on the fictional logic that there is a fascist coup d'etat taking place while denying that it is doing so, which is something new in the history of warfare. I mean, you don't generally invade countries and occupy their territory and then annex their territory and then claim the entire time that nothing of the sort is happening. It's also, I think, of a similar genre to the phenomenon of taking your country out of the European Union on the logic that you are going to rejoin an empire, which you are not going to rejoin, right? That strikes me as a similar example of this mixture of fiction and responsibility. What I'm going to try, the thesis that I'm going to advance is that this kind of multiple irresponsibility, this use of language to push us into a place where we seem to be doing something interesting, but in fact we're doing nothing. Or if we're doing something, the thing that we're doing is eroding the creations and the work of other people. That this particular thing has resemblances with fascism, sometimes powerful and revealing resemblances with fascism, but that it is also characteristically new in 21st century. For the purposes of this talk, I'm going to refer to this phenomenon as not even fascism. So with not even fascism, I think the characteristic pose is this farcical irresponsibility. The difference with fascism, and here I'm now going to propose some historical comparisons to you. The difference with fascism is that the fascist pose, again pose, I'm not trying to endorse this, the fascist pose is one of tragic responsibility. There are things about the world which demand that I do certain things though they might seem horrible. So let me just test this by comparing fascism and these phenomena we have in front of us across a few of the characteristic political categories of fascism itself. The first of these is time, which I've already mentioned. How do we think about time? This is something which comes before politics. The way fascists thought about time was that a global crisis was coming. This global crisis was going to somehow destroy or warp, ruin my nation, my race. Therefore, my nation, my race, my state was justified in taking some kind of extremely violent preemptive action in order to rescue itself from this coming global collapse. What do the not even fascists do? They also generally talk about some kind of threat in the future. Not the real threat, which hint, hint, is global warming, and hint, hint, notice how none of the people who are come up as heroes in this not even fascist story talk about global warming. In fact, many of them deny it, like Mr. Trump and like Mr. Putin and like a number of Europeans who are paid by Mr. Putin. right? It's a very interesting little side story. But so the future for the not even fascists is one of some kind of disaster. The migrants are going to take our jobs. The Jews are going to replace us. It's not nearly as fantastically overdrawn as the fascist version. And the way to respond to this coming crisis in the future is not to undertake some violent preemptive action. It is to destroy the only institutions that could possibly protect you. Right? That's different. Number two, the truth. So fascists and not even fascists, at first glance, have a very similar attitude about the truth. They deny most versions of endorsement of the truth or factuality that we would associate with the Enlightenment. But they do so in a different way. What the fascists say is, ignore empirical truth, ignore the small everyday truths, ignore the journalists, hate the journalists, but do so in the service of believing in a higher truth, right? The higher truth being the organic unity of the race, or the organic connection between the race and the leader, right? There is a higher truth. It's not an empirically demonstrable proof, but there is a kind of truth, the national truth, the racial truth, the truth of the leader. What the not even fascists do, it first looks similar. They say, don't believe the journalists, hate the journalists. But the next move is different. There's no big lie which serves to move you into the higher truth, right? There's no big lie. They might play with the old big lies, right? So basically every version of the Jewish international conspiracy, as I'm sure you've noticed, is now back. They might play with those things, but there's no really big lie which moves you into this higher truth. Instead, there are medium-sized lies. Medium-sized lies like a Russian girl was raped in Berlin by migrants, or Obama was born in Africa, or the Ukrainian government is fascist. Not lies that are so big that they force you to take on a whole worldview, but lies that are big enough that if you believe them, it's hard for you to make sense of the world. Big lies help you into some kind of worldview, some kind of mystical worldview. Medium-sized lies push you into a conspiratorial place where you start to doubt everything. And that is the big difference. Where you're supposed to end up with the not even fascists is that you believe your own truths. You believe whatever it is that feels best to you. You believe the thing that makes you feel good. Third comparison, the body. I'm going to try not to get personal about this one. So the body. In fascism, the way that you experienced the higher truth of the unity of the nation and the unity with the leader was that you got out in public. You marched, you demonstrated, you went off to war, looking similarly with similar haircuts, similar uniforms, similarly shined boots, in certain kinds of formation, moving in ways that you had been instructed to do. Physicality was very important to fascism. Not even fascism has a very different idea about the body. In not even fascism, we are in general not summoned to come out in public. We are not expected to march, protest. We're not even expected to go to war, at least not as a mass army, right? What we are expected to do is something very different. We're generally expected to stay at home. And people who encourage us to do otherwise, they are the conspirators. So basically, everyone from Mr. Trump eastward, Trump, Orban, Putin, you name it, now claims that if someone protests for voting rights, that's because they've been paid for by George Soros, which is, of course, the international Jewish conspiracy. Let's not mistake it. But it's also an example of this notion that protesting is bad. Getting out on the streets is bad. And interestingly, people who study Chinese censorship note that the one thing that makes the Chinese internet police really crazy is the possibility of organizing the physical presence of people outside. That's the main sin. That's sin number one. So this I think is a substantial difference. That fascism did want bodies doing things in the physical world. Not even fascism generally wants you on your couch. Number four, resources. Science and resource crisis. Here we have, I think, a pretty substantial similarity, one which is overlooked often in the history of fascism, but which I think is very interesting. Fascists said, as I mentioned before, fascists said a world crisis is coming, a catastrophe is coming, and it was a resource crisis. Therefore, we have to act fast. We have to assert our empire quickly. We have to act preemptively. We have to take what is our due before other people do this. And of course, for National Socialists, for Nazis, one of the things which was wrong with Jews was that Jews said there are principles of law or of Christian charity. Again, according to the Nazis, there are principles of Christianity that would prevent you from doing this kind of thing. But for the Nazis, there was a resource crisis, and the only way to deal with this resource crisis was to act violently and take land. Now, interestingly, in some of the less read passages of Mein Kampf, Hitler has some interesting things to say about technology. Hitler says, look, I'm aware that people are telling you that we could just irrigate or use hybrid seeds or use pesticides. I'm aware of all that, but science can't work to feed us. And the idea that science can work to feed us is actually an example of the Jewish international conspiracy. He speaks of it as a Jewish swindle. Now, does that remind you of anything at all? We too believe, most of us, many of us in different ways, that there is some kind of resource crisis coming, that this time it has to do with global warming. And many of us believe that there are scientific answers to this. The not even fascists, again, Mr. Trump, Mr. Putin are examples, either say, no, it's not really a crisis, or the science is wrong, thereby casting science itself into question. That is a very interesting similarity. The difference comes in, again, in the difference between tragic responsibility and farcical irresponsibility. So for the fascists said, science doesn't work, there's a resource crisis, therefore we must have colonies. The not even fascists say, a crisis is coming, science doesn't work, therefore we'll see, right? We'll see. We're not going to do much of anything. And interestingly, it connects back to the discourse of the wall in a profound way, which if you haven't already seen, I hope I can make clear. Why is there south-north migration in the world in general? I mean, of course, there are wars and there's ethnic cleansing and there are other intermediate factors, but whether it's Rwanda or Sudan or Syria, or whether it's Mexico and Central America, a fundamental driver is climate change. When Mexico gets so dry that Mexico City collapses into the earth, we're going to have more migration. When the Nile dries up, you're going to have more migration. When the drought in Libya increases from 100 days to 200 days, you're going to have more migration. There will be associated political events, and we will focus on those. But the fundamental driver of south to north migration is climate change. So in other words, the people who are saying, hey, let's let it all happen, are the same people who are saying, let's build a wall, right? There's a scientific solution. We're not going to take that route. Number 5, and this is maybe the most interesting one, is empire. So I've already alluded to what fascists think about empire. Empire is a good thing. The fascist moment is the last imperial moment in European history. Fascism, whether it's Italian or German this time, is a kind of catch-up to European empire. The Italians are going to take a bit of Africa. Hitler in Mein Kampf draws the conclusion that the only place for Europeans to create an empire is Europe. That's the only place left. Hence Europe, hence Ukraine, Belarus, Western Russia are his target. So the fascist view is that empire is a good thing. Now, what is the European Union? The European Union is your post-imperial solution. It is the first concerted form of European politics that is not only not imperial but post-imperial, in the sense that it gave former European empires, including Nazi Germany, a place to go. It gave former European imperial centers like Berlin, Paris, The Hague, place to go. Lisbon, Madrid, London, and then it gave former imperial peripheries, Prague, Bratislava, Warsaw, Tallinn, Riga, a place to go. That's what the European Union is. It is your form of post-imperial politics. I realize that's not the nice story about that you generally hear, but for the purposes of time, I'm not going to go into the nice story that you generally hear because, frankly, you hear it enough already, and it's completely untrue. The EU is your form of post-imperial politics. So it is the way that Europeans have found to have rule of law states and high levels of prosperity and high reported levels of happiness and long lives and so on and so forth without imperial exploitation, which is interesting. Now, what do the not even fascists say about this? What the not even fascists say is, let's go back to the nation state. But you never had nation states. There was never a British nation state. You can't go back to it. There was never a French nation state. You can't go back to it. And the German nation state existed, but it had some bad consequences. There is no period of sustained nation states in European history except for the Balkans in the 19th century. And the Balkan nation states are what brought us the First World War. So this idea, which most Europeans take for granted, let's just go back to the nation state. You might be against it, but you probably think it's possible. There's no reason to think that that's possible. What the not even fascists say is, let's go back to the nation state. But of course, they're very often dreaming of empire, right? So what is Brexit? Brexit is the claim that you can go back to the British nation state, which never existed. And what people have in mind is an empire which of course is not going to come back. I'm trained very rigidly as a historian not to make predictions, but I'm going to lay this one out. British troops are not going to reconquer India. They're not going to reconquer, although, I've got mixed feelings about it. The United States. Okay, these things are not going to happen. So it is a phantom, right? You're aiming at a phantom. The not even fascists are aiming at a phantom. But what does that mean for empire? There aren't European empires anymore, and there aren't going to be European empires, except for the Russian one, of course. What does it mean to aim for empire when empire is impossible? It means that you're helping the empires that actually exist in the world. Weakening the European Union or bringing about the end of the European Union will help empire. It will help the Chinese empire. It will help the Russian empire. It will make their life a lot easier at every level. So if you're aiming for European empires that don't exist, which you know somewhere, I assume all those Eton boys know somewhere that they're not really going to bring back the British Empire. It may be in their little toes, I don't know. But if you know somewhere you're not going to bring back the British Empire, you are going to help empire, though. Just not European ones. You're going to be helping Russia, and you're going to be helping China. That's where not even fascism leads us. The final thing, the final point of comparison is the state. So the fascists had a particular idea about the state, which was, we're going to take the traditional European rule of law state with its territorial sovereignty, and we're going to change certain aspects of it. We're going to build things inside the state that don't belong to the state, like paramilitary forces like the SS, the SA. And then we're going to use those forces to destroy other states. That's the very special history of Nazi Germany. We're going to destroy other states. We're going to say Poland is not a state and destroy it. The Soviet Union is not a state, try to destroy it. So fascism takes the European inheritance of the state and twists it and turns it against itself. So there is a fascist attitude towards the state, which is ambivalent, but which is definable. In fascism, you are loyal to the state, or you're supposed to be loyal to the state. That would be unquestionable. Now, that loyalty is not necessarily positive. It can be exaggerated. I'm sure you all know what one of the SS slogans was. It involved the word loyalty. But nevertheless, as a virtue, loyalty was certainly present in fascism. In not even fascism, things look a bit different. And let's start with loyalty. It's very interesting that a large number, let's say, of the not even fascists have significant connections to a country that is not their own. I would even venture the thesis that the not even fascists, in their way, are more cosmopolitan than the left is at the moment. I mean, we know what everyone thinks of Steve Bannon's current activity, and I think it's satanic, but what everyone thinks of Steve Bannon's current activity, it is a multinational initiative, right? And I mean, pushing this a little bit further, it's hard to imagine fascists having the kind of meeting with more important fascists that Mr. Trump has with Mr. Putin. We know more, just to take a random example, we know more about Antonescu's meetings with Hitler than we know about Trump's meetings with Putin. And that will probably always be true, right? The relationships that a number of these people have with Russia are very striking. Fascism in the 20s and 30s was a matter of separate independent movements. In the not even fascism of the present, you'll notice that basically everybody has some kind of connection which we can show with Russia. And if we can't show it, you'll be very hard-pressed to find a not even fascist who doesn't have nice things to say about Russia. Indeed, as soon as a new right-wing party appears on the scene and wins seats in a regional parliament, like Vox just did in Spain, as soon as that happens, what is the next thing that happens? They start talking about how great Russia is, right? That is different, and that is new. And I would submit that is not consistent with a tradition of hyper-nationalism. I mean, in general, whatever you say about nationalism, people who are nationalists usually think about their own country in some way and not about a second country. The attitude towards the state is also different. The attitude towards the state of the not even fascists is not that we pervert and then just destroy other people's states. The attitude seems to be, at least, and this might be stronger in the Anglo-Saxon world, the attitude seems to be, we are going to show that the state is not really good for anything. So in the case of the current shutdown, which from this distance might just look like typical American, chaos, there is an ideological logic to it. It is to show that the state is not good for anything. The state is not really very important. Or insofar as the state is important, it's important in the generation of these fictional emergencies, which we can then address by declaring a national emergency. In other words, the state, returning the point to language, is a purely discursive entity. It can't change your life, it can't clean your water, it can't clean your food, it can't build your roads, it can't give you pensions, it can't educate your children, it can't do those things. But it can stop a bunch of Mexicans who aren't coming anyway by not building a wall that we talk about. That the state can do. And so in that sense, talking about language actually brings us to the heart of the matter. Okay, so I've been trying to make you laugh, but not too much, which is always a hard balance to strike. I'm sure you've already recognized the conceit of the talk, which is a quotation from Marx, which everyone knows, right? That history repeats itself. Once is tragedy, a second time is farce. But here's the thing. On the stage, a farce is nice. I went to the comic opera the other night. I saw a farce. It was nice. In real life, a farce is a dangerous, terrible thing. The particular kind of farcical irresponsibility that we're dealing with opens the way to all kinds of bad forms of politics. So, for example, if we say there's no truth, it's very hard to govern. If we lose the ability to talk about the future, it's very hard to think of policy. If we get out of the habit of appearing in public, it's very hard to protest and to meet new people. If we say to global warming, laissez-faire, laissez-aller, then we'll have unpredictable wars, migrations. If we are indifferent about empire or pursue imperial phantoms, other empires are going to benefit. And if we dismantle or weaken the state, we won't be able to respond to any of these challenges in any way at all. So, is this fascism? I would say there are certain elements of fascism here. There's certainly a borrowing of fascist language. It's worth following the history of fascism because it helps us get our minds around some of this. Some of it is not fascist. Some of it is new. Some of it is a response to the digital world Some of it is a response to extreme economic inequality. Some of it is indeed new. But here's the thing. The fact that it's not completely fascist doesn't mean that it's okay. I mean, this is a move which is made in both Europe and the United States. You say, well, it doesn't look like the Kaczynski, the Orban, the Putin, the Trump, the Erdogan, the Duterte, the whoever. It doesn't look exactly like fascism. And so then we just spring back to everything's okay, right? It doesn't quite look like fascism, therefore everything is normal. That's the politics of inevitability talking, right? That's what the politics of inevitability says to us. There are no alternatives. Things are basically going in a certain direction. All these things are just blips. That's the politics of inevitability talking. So how do we do something which is not the politics of inevitability? How do we do something which is not the politics of eternity? I think the first thing to say is what I said at the beginning, that we have to be careful. We have to be not just careful about our own language, but we have to be creative with our own language. There is no unengaged point with language. To think so is the politics of inevitability. There is no unengaged point. There's no way not to be engaged. But engagement doesn't just mean worrying about saying the wrong thing. Engagement has to also mean talking about the future, filling the future with content, filling the future with concepts, filling the future with possibilities. The most characteristic thing about politics in the West today is the Zukunftslosigkeit. It's the total absence of the future. And the only way to start scratching our way back into it is by using language, I think, in a creative, forceful way. Second thing that we can do is we can realize that the problems that we're having, although they're expressed in language and language is one way of dealing with them, are not entirely discursive. To think that things are only discursive is, I submit, one of the traditional mistakes of the 21st century left. There are basic reforms which have to do with the state and structure and inequality, like, for example, the death of local news, or the rise of inequality of wealth, or the assault on digital privacy. All of these things make it easier for the not even fascists to do what they do. Addressing the not even fascists is not merely a matter of addressing them with words, it's also a matter of changing some of these structural conditions. The word that I use for this in the book, and the answer, which is the best answer that I can think of to venture in general for how we deal with all of this, would be something like a politics of responsibility. That, of course, we know that there isn't going to be progress in any kind of automatic way. But it's also a mistake to think, whether you regret it or not, that we must face a cyclical doom of climate change or migrants. We don't face that either. We have more resources of various kinds than humans have ever possessed in the history of the world. It's not inevitable that bad things happen any more than it was inevitable that good things happen. We just can't count on history to provide either the good or the bad. Because, and this is what the language of history is all about, what the language of history says is that we use concepts to identify what comes from us from the past, the structures, so that we can recognize both the limits and the opportunities to see the present and to change it. And that's where I'm going to stop. Thank you.
Tim, thank you for that upbeat view of the future.
There was one upbeat at the end. Didn't you hear it?
I got it. We're going to push for that. But I'd like to take up one thing, the borrowing of language. That's a really interesting, or the sometimes misappropriation of language. Here I have here. Very familiar to the audience here, the way the Nazis misappropriated language. Certain words you can't even use anymore here, Selektion. Simple English word selection, but in German that has a connotation which makes it pretty much unusable. And there are a whole bunch of other words that were used. There's a dictionary of words that the Nazis used that we can no longer use here. Can you give us a couple of specific examples of how language is being misappropriated or borrowed in a weird way today? Because it's an interesting topic.
Well, the examples are all around us. But when I consider Klemperer, one of the things which was interesting about Klemperer, this literary critic, historian of literature, who is paying attention to Nazi language, is that he did a very good job of finding patterns. There was a Polish linguistic scholar called Michał Głowinski who did the exact same thing for communism later on. I'm struck in the 21st century, I'll give you some examples, but I'm struck in the 21st century by how it's much more scattershot, right? How it's often not just at the level of the particular word or phrase, but at the kind of sentence, at the level of sentence, right? So think of how sentences are used in Twitter. Like once you read a sentence on Twitter, it makes a certain impression on you that you can't get rid of, even though it's not, it's not true in any normal sense. Some of the striking examples in the 21st century for me are extremism, terrorism, and rape. I mean, not that these are words that shouldn't be used at all. I think maybe extremism shouldn't be used at all. But extremism, for example, in Russian law means anything the government doesn't like. And if you think about it, extremism actually is rather difficult to define. And I see extremism creep into everyday public usage. It's an example of a word which, going back to the introduction, now figures routinely in newspapers as though it were some kind of neutral thing. But what exactly is an extremist? And, don't we all have some views about certain things that are a little extreme? And isn't that normal that we might have some views about certain things that are a bit extreme? Should we all actually have moderate views about everything? Would that really be normal? Terrorism is another good example, especially terrorism as attached to things. So in America, Islamic is attached to terrorism, even though most of the terrorists in America look like this. They belong to this demographic that I'm pointing to right now. We commit most of the terrorist acts, either in terms of the numbers or in terms of how many people are killed. That's what a terrorist in America looks like. It looks like me. I mean, maybe, okay. But the adjective Islamic, right, fits with terrorism. Right-wing does not fit with terrorism. As soon as it's right-wing, then it's a gunman, which is another example of, like, that's a word which is a euphemism. So a white male American citizen who walks into a public place and shoots people is a gunman, right? And now that word, is lost to the language. Yeah. Rape is another good example, that the category of rapists, which Mr. Trump used when he announced his candidacy for the presidency, the Mexicans, some of them are rapists, right? Which is used in an Islamic, in the context of Muslims here in the European Union. And what that does, of course, is it gets us to these elemental fears and these elemental needs to protect. So those are a few examples which immediately spring to mind. I mean, if going on the other side, democracy. Okay, so now not Mr. Trump, not the bad fascists, but us, or Americans in general. Democracy. What is democracy? I mean, in American usage, democracy is us, go team. That's democracy. And that prevents us from noticing, I mean, not only the flaws that are built into the system, but that since 2010, since we legalized corporate donation, since 2013, when the Supreme Court legalized voter suppression, since those, we've become substantially less democratic in this period, right? So on the other side, democracy is another word which has been dulled.
What is it about Russia? You look at Russia today, and you're right, in some ways all roads lead to Moscow. This is a country that, I mean, demonstrably has tried to destroy most of our democratic systems. And yet there's a substantial body of support for it in Western Europe. A lot of the more extreme movements take money from Russia. Are they just smarter than we are?
In some ways. So, I mean, everyone has the vices of their virtues. America, in some ways, is a low-trust society, but in some ways it's a high-trust society. With law and media, it's a high-trust society. And from the Russian point of view, that's just a soft target, right? So in 2016, I looked on with, dismay as the kinds of tactics which were used in Russia or in Ukraine were applied successfully in the United States. And I just couldn't get Americans to see that, like, not only is this stuff not true and a kind of politics, but it's a kind of politics which has been used before and it comes from a certain place. So in a certain way, they're smarter than we are, but like everyone has the vices and the virtues. So the thing they don't understand is that if they use a campaign of Twitter bot-driven and email theft-driven lies and distortions to get their guy into the presidency, that doesn't mean that the whole system falls down, right? Because it's hard for them to envision what a high-trust society looks like. So they imagine that if you just get your guy into the top, that's all that happens, and all the other institutions fall into line, which is not as true. I'll put it this way. It's not as true as they want it to be, right? Another thing which has happened with Russia is that, and this is just luck, right? It was good luck for the Americans, and then it was bad luck for the Americans. A continuity in Russian counterintelligence is the use of policies of provocation, right, or active measures. So intelligence is when you try to find stuff out. Counterintelligence is keeping the other guy from finding stuff out. Active measures are when you look for the psychological weakness. I'm not doing it now. I'm just looking at you in a nice neutral way. You look for the psychological weakness of your opponent, and you try to get your opponent to do the things that aren't in his interest for reasons that he can't quite understand. Active measures were a big part of what the Okhrana did in the imperial period. They were a big part of what helped the early Soviet Union to survive. And at least in my reading, the Soviet Union was always much better at this than the Americans were. We were not very good at this kind of thing. Too many steps of thought and so on. But if the Cold War had been about intelligence, I'm an American institution, so I can say these kinds of things, we would have lost. If it had been about intelligence, we would have lost. But it wasn't about intelligence. By the 70s and 80s, it was about technological production in the three-dimensional world. And so the Cold War went the way that it went. However, if in the 70s and 80s technology was about creating three-dimensional things that changed your life, like refrigerators and cars, by the 2000s, especially 2010s, it was no longer about those things. We still had refrigerators and cars, but technology was now about the internet, and in particular, it was about social platforms on the internet. And those social platforms on the internet, although Americans thought they were great and they were going to project our values outward and all this nonsense, what those things actually do is they make active measures a lot easier. So if you were going to be a Soviet carrying out active measures in the US, and they certainly tried, you had to somehow get into a newspaper or write somebody a letter or set up an extremely complicated set of human interactions. Facebook made it much, much, much easier because thanks to Facebook, not only Facebook, but Facebook was the main example, thanks to Facebook, you can find out the psychological vulnerabilities of people on a mass scale, and you can exploit them. So an active measure which was carried out in 2016 was to bomb African-American voters with the message that Hillary Clinton was a racist in order to suppress black voting, right? That's one of many active measures which were used in the 2000 campaign on behalf of, to help Mr. Trump. So what happened was that by way of technological luck in the 70s and 80s, the Cold War went a certain direction. Then the nature of the dominant technology changed, and the Russians, basically doing the same thing, plugging away the whole time, found suddenly that they could reach Americans in a way they could never reach them before. And we, of course, were not ready for this because we thought the internet was just this thing which was neutral, and everything which is neutral is, of course, going to work for us in the end. There's a lot more to say about Russia, but... Well, you want me to say it?
Sure.
Okay. So...
While you're going.
So I think that the fundamental answer of your question, like why Russia, right? There are lots of things people say about Russia, like, oh, it's always been authoritarian, or it's, the czars, and they have to have centralized power. I don't think Russia is any less capable of evolution than any other society. I don't think that Russia is stuck in some kind of fate or in some kind of non-historical trajectory. I don't think that at all. And I think that kind of analysis of why Russia matters today is always going to lead us astray. I think the reason why Russia is interesting and important is that Russia has gotten to certain places before the West. Okay? So the traditional way we look at Russia is we say, oh, well, there's democracy and there's capitalism and there was a transition, and some people made the transition and some people sadly just didn't make the transition and they've kind of left the highway of history, right? That's the politics of inevitability. There's one way to go. It's liberalism, democracy, capitalism. And Russia sadly just didn't make it. Right? And so this is, that's the whole American commentariat in 2016. That's Mr. Obama saying Russia's only a regional power, right? That's the politics of inevitability. There's one route to the future, and the Russians, unfortunately, their minibus crashed into a pole somewhere, and it's just unfortunate. However, that's exactly the wrong way to see it, because really what's interesting about Russia is that tendencies that are inside the West have reached a higher expression there, right? So the offshoring of wealth. Germans do that. Americans do it more, and Russians do it even more, right? Inequality of wealth and income. You have a problem, we've got a much bigger problem. Russia has a still bigger problem. Time in front of the screen. You've got a problem, we've got a bigger problem. The Russians have a still bigger problem. What they do in politics represents an equilibrium point of how you do politics when people live in front of screens, when there's extreme inequality of wealth, when nobody believes in the rule of law, when democracy is ritualized. They've figured out how to do that, right? And because they figured out how to do it, the only thing they can do, and this is what they are doing, is to try to bring us closer to them. So Russia, I mean, this is, again, new in the history of politics, I think, and interesting. The Russians are not proposing a model, right? You notice that, like, it's true that all the American white supremacists love them, and it's true that, like, basically every right-wing party in Europe talks about that they're great. But you notice that the Russians don't actually organize convoys to bring the white supremacists to look and see how great it is in Siberia. They don't do that, right? Unlike the Soviet Union, they don't do that kind of thing. It's not, the Russians don't have a vision, right? When the Soviets could show you a dam, I mean, they could show you something they were doing, which was interesting. The Russians don't do that. The Russians don't have a vision. What the Russians have is the idea that we've gotten to this point, we need to maintain this point, and we need to show the Russian population that, here comes a famous phrase, there is no alternative. And the way to show them there is no alternative is to discredit the British and the Americans and the European Union. And the way to discredit them, and this is where it gets interesting, is to actually make them function worse. And that might have seemed incredibly ambitious 5 years ago, but maybe it seemed a little bit less ambitious now, right? Would Brexit have happened if 20% of the Twitter conversation had not been organized in a foreign country? Would Brexit have happened without RT's attitude towards Brexit? Would Brexit have happened without Russian funding of individual British politicians during Brexit? Would Mr. Trump have been elected without the theft of Hillary Clinton's emails? Almost certainly not, by the way. The theft of her emails was hugely structurally important to that whole election, and that's not even mentioning the other things they did for him. So it might seem extraordinary to say, oh, the easiest way to make Russia look like the only alternative is to get rid of the alternatives, but they have actually done a fair amount in the last few years along those lines. And one of the things I like to do, put this in perspective, is like the American military budget, right? The American military budget. You know how much like an F-35 costs? You know how much a tire of an F-35 costs? It costs about as much as the Russian cyber budget. Right?
Kathleen Van Hol.
Not that you shouldn't buy our F-35s. They're great. If you flap the wings the right way, they can stop a cyber war.
So Kathleen Van Hol from the New York Times is here. Her newspaper is banned in China. You just can't get it. You can get it in Russia. But you can get anything in Russia. It was a great surprise to me to go to Russia, having spent time in China, and to realize that you can get pretty much any media outlet that you could name from the West. But nobody believes what's written there because they don't believe what Putin tells them, so they don't believe anything. And I realized you're in this sort of almost this science fiction world where there's absolutely nothing that is true. How do you run a human society like that?
Well, I mean, this is why I think Russia should be an object of interest, rather than a subject of dismissal. I don't say, by the way, since we're in Germany, I'll just add, not an object of sympathy for the regime necessarily. Like, just because Russia is interesting doesn't mean they have to build a pipeline which doesn't go through Ukraine, right? But there's no, I mean, but what the Russians have done is they have, the Russians are an example of the kind of politics I've been trying to talk about, where the head of state of Russia, Mr. Putin, consciously refers to and revives Russian fascists. He cites Russian fascists, he uses their turns of phrase, he endorses their ideas, he reburies their bodies, he lays flowers at their graves. But is it fascism? No, it's not fascism. It draws from fascism. It exploits certain fascist techniques, but it's not fascism. Mr. Putin is, it is, I think, the biggest understatement possible to say that Mr. Putin is personally not interested in the redistribution of wealth. I mean, it'd be harder to find a bigger underestimation than that, right? Whereas fascists did redistribute. I mean, they did it by stealing and killing Jews and other minorities, but they were interested in using the state to move wealth around. That is the last thing that Mr. Putin and the people around Mr. Putin are interested in. It's not fascism. It has some elements that it owes some debts to fascism, but it is in fact a hydrocarbon oligarchy whose mission is to convince people that there are no alternatives. And the best way to persuade people there are no alternatives is to get rid of factuality. And getting rid of factuality, as I tried to suggest earlier with the F-35 example, is actually relatively cheap, right, compared to other things. For example, compared to building up factuality. So the Anglo-Saxon tradition says, I mean, this is naive and it's a bit American, but the Anglo-Saxon tradition says, if you just have no restraints on conversation, then the facts will come out. And that, I just submit, is simply not true, right? That is simply not true. If you have no restraints at all, you will have a jungle in which it will be very hard to come to facts, and indeed people will stop believing in facts. And this is, by the way, what the Russians do. They build a jungle. They over-fertilize a jungle in which, on television, every point of view is represented. So did the Americans land on Mars? Let's represent all points of view. Oh, sorry, the moon. Let's say the moon, because that did actually happen.
See?
Yes, it did. Let's say the moon. Did the Americans? It's been 50 years. So that, it's been 50 years since the Americans landed on the moon. Did it happen? Let's bring in five views. View number one: there is no moon. View number two was filmed in Hollywood. View number three: it happened, but those were actually Russians, and we just wanted to make them feel better. View number four. It happened, but it actually happened 20 years earlier. Let's have a discussion, right? That's how it works. You can fill the space with fiction. You can fill the available space, whether the space is an hour-long television discussion or whether it's a discussion in the public. You can fill it up with nonsense. That's what happened when the Russians shot down MH17. The Russians shot down MH17. It was totally clear the Russians shot down MH17. They had invaded a country. They had sent in men. They had sent in anti-aircraft. They'd been using anti-aircraft to shoot down Ukrainian planes day after day, week after week, that whole spring, with Russian crews and Russian weapons, and then they accidentally shut down a civilian airliner. Why on earth would anyone think it was anybody except Russia? But how did they play it? Well, maybe it was the CIA, and maybe the plane was already filled with dead bodies before it left Amsterdam, and maybe it was a Ukrainian exercise. And by the way, a Ukrainian Jewish oligarch controls all of Ukrainian airspace, and you can tell he's guilty. I'm not making these examples up, by the way. We can tell he's guilty because of the shape of his face, and here's an expert which is going to analyze the shape of his nose and tell you that he's guilty. You can tell by the way he moves his nose. All of those things, right? From those things you cannot, and I'm missing some examples too. From those things you cannot get at the truth. So this is, I mean, you've stated it exactly. It's something new, right? You just believe what you feel like. You believe what you feel like about MH17. And, the opinion polls in Russia show that the vast majority of Russians believe that Ukraine was in some way responsible for shooting down MH17, which is, I mean, to put it mildly, unfair. Ukraine was the country on whose territory an invading army shot down a civilian airliner. So to say that Ukraine is to blame is just about as unfair as any conclusion you could draw, but more than 80% of Russians believe that. And so, yeah, you fill up the space with stuff that isn't true, and then the consequence is that people adopt this pose, which is also very popular in the West, which is to say, well, what is truth anyway? What is truth? Who knows what's true? Right? That's a popular pose, You've heard that. You'll probably hear that before the day is out. And you'll leave this place, those of you, like the guys with the beards, you're going to all go to bars afterwards, and somebody's going to say that before the night is up, right? Your left-wing friends are going to say that. You're going to say, anyway. So they appeal to that tendency in us. They strike that nerve in us, and it works, and they just push outward and outward and outward.
Okay, one more question, then I'll open it up. Round about 2 years ago, maybe early 2017, you told, I think, Salon Online magazine that Trump was going to declare a state of national emergency, take power, dissolve everything, and it was going to be like Hitler taking over after the Reichstag. At the time, people said...
You know what, Terry? I don't think that's a direct quote, actually.
Maybe not the last bit. Maybe not the last bit. But at the time, this was regarded as, you know, Tim's gone overboard, and this is total alarmism, never going to get that far. Could you give us a report card?
Yeah. I mean, what I actually told it to a reporter. I said something like that first to a reporter from the Süddeutsche Zeitung, I think. And what I said was that we have basically 18 months to do things. And that I hold to. I mean, we did have about that much time. And fortunately, people did do things. And one of the things that people helpfully did was they talked about politics of emergency. In the American public sphere, I mean, it was a discussion which wouldn't have seemed necessary, but in the American public sphere, people talked, and smart people talked about the politics of emergency, thereby making the politics of emergency harder to exploit than it would have been otherwise. But, you know, here we are. And the only thing one can say is that because we've had some time to think about this and smart people have been talking about it, there's no one in the U.S. military above a certain rank, and it's a low rank, who hasn't thought about this. And there's nobody in the FBI who hasn't thought about this eventuality, right? They've all thought about it. And talking about differences, I mean, one of the striking differences between this particular American leader and fascists of the 20s and 30s is that he has very, very bad relations with what the communists like to call the power ministries. And that's a very important structural difference. I mean, it's unusual for a very high percentage of the important officers and thinkers to believe that their head of state is a traitor. But that is the case in the United States of America right now. So the politics of a national emergency are trickier for him for that reason. That he doesn't, you know, it was a little bit tricky. I mean, not to minimize this, it was a little bit tricky for Hitler as well. Like for Hitler, it was a long process of marching through the institutions. But for Mr. Trump, from the beginning, has gone the other way. I mean, he's fired people at the top of the institutions, but he hasn't acted in such a way as to bring the institutions towards him. And the institution that he strengthened, border control or ICE in particular, is not the kind of institution which would be really helpful in politics in a true national emergency. But anyway, I mean, report card. He doesn't have much choice but to try this. I would say he has very little choice but to try this. Because he doesn't have policy, he doesn't have mass public support, and the other thing he doesn't have is the support of much of the American state. And he's facing what I think Americans will come to see as the reality that his campaign had some rather unusual relationships with a foreign country, which is what my book was actually about. So I'm not surprised that we're here, but I think we're going to get through it.
And Mr. Mueller hasn't had his say yet. Who has a question? Let's start at the front and work back. Sir. Can you wait for the microphone, please, because we're recording. Thank you.
Thank you. I found very interesting your beginning, especially when you talked about us, because we don't tend to reflect a lot. And that kind of bothered me because it's kind of in the title of the speech, the word fascism. If it's not quite fascism, why do we keep using a word that is so drenched with the historical meaning of an historical representation, and that is not quite, there are quite substantial differences between what we see right now and what fascism ever was. Isn't that a simplistic thing? Are we doing ourselves a favor by using always the word fascism like the word, like socialism is used? Aren't they outdated terms? They're not quite represent any longer the phenomenon we're witnessing?
I see your point, but I mean, I think both fascism and socialism are real things in the world that we live in. One can debate about how important they are. When I tried to characterize these political movements in major Western states as not even fascist, I was hoping to use the term fascism in a constructive way. That is, it's a reference point which helps us to see something else, even if that something else is not entirely it. I haven't noticed, I mean, we may move in different circles, I haven't noticed that everybody's talking about fascism all the time. Except for, of course, I mean, the Russian presidential administration is talking about fascism all the time. But I haven't noticed that it's been so central to the discussion of what's going on. Maybe in Europe. Yeah. And I am sensitive to the possibility for abuse. But as a historian, I can't, especially as a historian of fascism, I can't help but see it as a real thing in the world. that's not just a category that flips on and off like a light switch, right? So when we think about the history of Spain, for example, was Spain fascist? I think after long consideration, I think the answer is no. But I couldn't have come to that conclusion without a great deal of engagement with the term itself. And I wouldn't be able to say, well, this person in Spain was a fascist and this idea was fascist without the concept, even if the final conclusion is no. So I hope I can persuade you that the purpose of my talk was not just to say like everything's fascist or it's not, but rather to say that fascism is a real thing in history and it therefore can be used. The other part of the answer is that we can choose not to refer to fascism and fascists, but we can't stop other people. So Mr. Bannon, for example, who was the campaign manager of the President of the United States, actively refers to and revises fascist traditions. Mr. Putin, who's the President of the Russian Federation, actively refers to and revises fascist traditions. I can't make him stop that by not talking about it, right? So that's the other part.
The gentleman here, and then we'll move back. Lady right behind.
Thank you for an interesting talk. I was particularly interested in this idea that centrists had, through the politics of inevitability, enabled the rise of what we might call neofascism. I wondered also, however, whether something else was at play, which one might call the politics of imitation, in that before President Trump started talking about a wall, President Obama was the record deporter of people from the United States. As the AfD rose in Germany, Chancellor Merkel was already talking with President Erdogan about stopping migration from Turkey, and even before Matteo Salvini came to power in Italy, the centre-left Marco Minici was dealing with Libyan militias and stopping migration from Libya. So, to what extent was that politics of imitation of far-right rhetoric and policy also an enabler of what's happened, or do you feel it was still nevertheless already in play because of the politics of inevitability?
Well, I'm going to agree with you, but on a slightly different logic. So one of the things the politics of inevitability does is it disables critique of self. And the U.S. in the 21st century is, I think, a really good example of this. So take the invasion of Iraq, for example. We invade an essentially randomly chosen country for reasons that we know are false, in reaction to a terrorist attack which involved nationals of a different country a couple of years earlier. We killed tens and probably hundreds of thousands of people. We don't have any idea what it is we mean to do with the occupation of this country. We don't even exploit its resources, right? We fail even in the traditional imperial goal of fighting wars. But what's interesting is not a single, I mean, you may correct me, maybe somebody will correct me, but as far as I know, not a single major architect of that policy has managed to find a sentence in which he would say, maybe this was a mistake and here's why we made that mistake. And the war in Iraq was, of course, the politics of inevitability. The rationale that we gave for invading Iraq was that, and we said this pretty much in so many words, was if we destroy an authoritarian state, if we just knock it over, then democracy will spring up, because that's just the way history works. There aren't really alternatives. So this idea that there are no alternatives was announced as Iraq, and we don't reflect on that. I start with the Republicans to move to the Democrats, because the politics of inevitability disables Democrats from criticizing Democrats. So Obama must be, following the arc of history, right? That must be right, even if, as you say, there are a lot of ways in terms of numbers, like casualties in Afghanistan and so on. There are a lot of numbers or use of drones where something else seems to be happening, at least as well, right? It's not to say that everything that Obama did was wrong, but at least as well. It disables critique because you don't have a language for critique. Somehow this is just a blip, or this is just a bump in the road. The main story is we've got the first African-American president, and that's part of a larger story of American correction and moving towards democracy. So I think the politics of inevitability disabled, but the politics of inevitability also, in political strategic terms, goes under the name of triangulation. Because if you're in the politics of inevitability and you're on the left, right, that's Schroeder, Blair, Clinton. What the politics of inevitability means is that you don't actually have a language with the left, which the left always had, sometimes crazily, sometimes helpfully, which the left always had of, here's what a better future looks like, right? Clinton didn't really have that, right? Clinton number one. Clinton really, who was an incredibly gifted politician and did a number of good things, but what he had was the ability to say, we're going to end welfare as we knew it, right? What he had was the ability to find something in the middle with the status quo. And that's not the future, right? That's the politics of inevitability. So the politics of inevitability means that the left no longer thinks it has to see the future, because all you have to do is basically keep the car on the road. So that's where I would go with this.
I will be greedy and ask two questions, but they'll be very short. Number one, in your parallels between fascism and not even fascism, one category I'm interested in is business and corporations. Hitler had a lot of very prominent businesses supporting him from even before he came to power. We know a lot of existing big German businesses who have a Nazi past and benefited from fascism. So I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on the world of business today and to what extent they might actually be colluding in this erosion of democracy for their own benefit. Secondly, just not like holding on to, hopefully, to your final notions of sort of optimism or potential optimism. There is one view which one could think of, which is that liberal democracy had this sort of 30 glorieuses, 30 years of expansion between 1974 when fascism fell in Portugal, all the way through the color revolutions in Ukraine. And since then, the indicators tell us, crudely, but nevertheless, that it has been shrinking in the world. We now have the growth of illiberal democracy, whatever that term really means or whether it's justified, but it's sort of helpful. And, you could think of it as perhaps something returning to the stage that we haven't had since 1989, which is a kind of competition with another system. And the question I would pose to you is, isn't that possibly a good thing? Because does capitalism now have to actually present alternatives? Because there are alternatives, and we have to make life look better where we are, and perhaps think about social inequalities in a more serious way than before.
Okay. So in a way, the questions turn out to be related, because you're asking first empirically, does business collude? And at the end, you're asking, does capitalism present us with alternatives? To start from the kind of meta-historical place, I don't believe that the market and democracy stand in the kind of causal relationship that a dominant school of political science once held that they did. I think the market and democracy both depend on the rule of law, and that without the rule of law, the market ends up discrediting ideas of rights and democracy, which is what happened in Russia and other places in the early 1990s, which is one of the things which is special about Russia. Russia moves through our politics of inevitability very quickly. We offer our politics of inevitability. Market creates democracy. Market creates law. And they realize very quickly that this is not true, which it's not. So any competition, I don't think, is going to involve capitalism as such offering political alternatives, because I don't believe capitalism offers political alternatives. I believe that capitalism, I'll tell you what capitalism is. Capitalism is always already a political system. You can't have markets without the state, and so on and so forth. I don't think capitalism offers us political systems. And this is like, I agree with what you're saying about competition, but I think the competition has to be at a different level. It has to be at the level of NGOs and individuals and political parties coming up with alternatives. Because where we're stuck is the way that this transition, like Havel said in Politics in Power of the Powerless, the line between the oppressor and the oppressed is not between the system and the society, it runs through every person. So when you say like that democracy is receding, authoritarianism is advancing, yes, it's also advancing inside us all the time, inside our societies, inside us as individuals. It's not that like countries suddenly change colors, right? There's a little bit of luck and contingency in which who loses an election at the wrong time. But this movement, this counter movement that I'm calling the politics of eternity, or not even fascism, is also moving inside us all of the time, right? And so we have to be the ones who react to it. And the way, and I like and I accept and I endorse your idea of a competition. It's a competition that you have to realize you're in. Because the way that inevitability dulls us is it thinks there are no alternatives, there are no alternatives, there are no alternatives, until the alternatives are like literally in your living room. And then you say, oh, okay, I never really cared about this freedom thing so much in the first place, right? So what we have to do is be able to catch ourselves before we get this flip from I was never responsible for progress and now it's not my fault that things are going badly. So but I basically agree with you. I think it's a helpful moment, but it's only a helpful moment also if we see the alternatives as alternatives, right? So this is what Russia is like. Like Russia, I mean, the American idea about Russia until 2016 was that it had ceased to exist. And now there's a temptation to say, oh, well, Russia is like this incredibly exotic alien thing which like runs us by remote control. But Russia is actually a country, right? I mean, and it's an alternative. And so we have to be able to see these alternatives. Anyway, that's as good as I can do.
Travis, you want to have this gentleman here, and then we can go back with this one there, and then...
I'd also like to annex the previous question, but firstly, I'd like to thank you very much for a talk that was very thought-provoking, and I'm trying to use some of the filters you encouraged us to put ourselves through to think about what you said. And one of the things you said was that we get comfortable believing things that we emotionally want to believe, and that we're all susceptible to that. And I'm wondering, when you talk about Russia and Putin manipulating our elections, I'm very sad about Britain leaving the European Union, and I would really love to believe that that's Putin's fault, but I don't think that I can. I mean, people really don't like the EU. People in Britain were very unhappy, and a lot of money and sophistication went into the Remain campaign. And Cambridge Analytica couldn't get Ted Cruz nominated, and all the money in the world couldn't get Ted Cruz nominated over Donald Trump. I mean, I'm not happy with either of them, but there is a reality, there's a fertile ground on which this is falling, and to say that Putin is orchestrating this relieves us of perhaps too much blame, and I think gives Putin too much agency. Is he just going with many events so as to seem to be mastering them, as Taylor said about Bismarck? Are we... It's a comfortable narrative for us to believe that he's pulling strings and that our worldview is falling apart because of him and not because of our failure to maintain the system properly. So that's the question. That's the tension that your talk arose in me.
But why? The thing is, why is that a choice? I mean, the answer is both. Because the moment that we say it's all us and not Russia, we're not taking Russia seriously enough. It's not a choice. The reason why Russian tactics work is because they look into our societies and see the seams and see the weaknesses. So I'm not going to persuade you, not least because I can't be sure of it myself, that Russia determined the outcome of Brexit. But until you've read the studies by the internet researchers who retroactively followed the Twitter campaign and realized that 20% of the discussion of on Twitter about Brexit was organized by a foreign power, you haven't made up your mind, right? Because you don't, like, it may feel to you like lots of British people were against it. Yeah, sure, they were. But there are other things going on which you don't necessarily see until we look into that other world. And that other world matters. It matters quite a lot. I mean, in the United States, people spend 11 hours a day in front of the screen. What do we think then matters to them? In the United States, an absolute majority of people were getting their news from Facebook. In the last month before the elections, the top 20 fictional stories, many of which were thought up by bright minds in no other country but Russia, were read more often than the top 20 true stories. Maybe that didn't make any difference at all. But I think it actually did. With the Russian campaign against the U.S., they are telling us it's a cyber war. I mean, you can say like that's like they're just pumping themselves up, but they basically say like, yeah, we did it. I mean, maybe they're just bragging, but the email intervention alone. I mean, imagine that a foreign power, not some 20-year-old, Imagine that a foreign power hacked the emails of a major German political party right in the sensitive 6 months before the election, and then dropped them repeatedly at critical moments. In October, there was a moment when everybody, including I think Mr. Trump, thought he was done because a tape was released in which he said it was okay to sexually assault women. What did his Russian friends do? 30 minutes after that tape came out, 30 minutes, they released a whole trove of stolen emails which switched the subject to supposed sexual crimes by Hillary Clinton. His campaign did not have the resources to do that. They did not steal those emails, Russia did. So in a close election, which Mr. Trump won, remember, by 70,000 total votes in a country where roughly 130 million people cast a ballot, I think it's legitimate to ask whether that might not have actually swung the ballot. So, I mean, the whole book is, I go into this, and there's, probably one of the leading political scientists of presidential communications, Professor Jameson, has also just published a book about this, in which she makes a much better case than I can that it did actually swing the election. But, I mean, I take your point about responsibility. I just think we have to take responsibility for understanding the whole picture as well. The way that I think Russia is useful is that it helped, because it's not about how we're going to change Russia, right? It is about how we're going to change ourselves. The way Russia is useful is that Russia shows us where our weaknesses actually are. So to give the example that I mentioned earlier about voter suppression, right? That was probably the most significant after the email thefts. Voter suppression of African Americans was a joint American-Russian effort, right? Everybody was doing it in 2016, with the result that seriously fewer numbers of African Americans voted. I mean, some of it was because Obama was not on the ballot, no doubt, but Russians and Americans in different ways were trying to suppress the African American vote. That, for Americans, is a reminder that just because we have a black president doesn't mean racism is over, right? Every single thing that they did, they knew that Michigan and Wisconsin were going to be crucial, and they poured in on Michigan and Wisconsin in the last couple of weeks. That's a reminder to us that our electoral college system is a little bit stupid and vulnerable, right? And so on and so forth. The fact that Facebook transmitted chiefly fiction, even though it was the major American news source, that's a problem, right? Russia helps us to see this problem. So for me, it's not either or. I mean, I think it's very important to give other countries agency too, right? We can't solve America can't solve Russia's problems, but it's a mistake not to give Russia agency. Russia has agency, and they demonstrated that agency, and they did something which was very intelligent, and it happened to work. But as you say, it could only work because of basic problems in the American system. And I think the most practical way to respond is by fixing the American problems. And by the way, there's a whole other class of things which go beyond the U.S. and Russia, which help explain Putin and Trump. One of them is offshoring of wealth, right? I mean, the thing that brought Trump and the Russians together well before politics was a mutual interest in ways to offshore wealth. The first contact between Trump and Russians were Russians buying his real estate in order to launder money, right? And between the moment when Mr. Trump was nominated and the moment when he was elected, 70% of the real estate purchases of Trump properties came from anonymous offshore entities, right? Like, that they were Russian is one issue, but that we should not allow that to happen, right? American law should not allow that to happen is another. So
let's go back, because we're kind of just doing the front. Can you get that gentleman? We only got, we haven't done the back. See the gentleman with the glasses, and he's at his hand. Yeah, right there. Gentleman with his glasses. Right there.
Hier, zu uns.
Thank you.
Oh, well. He had his hand up, and he put his hand up.
Thank you very much for your talk. And as you know, since our first encounter on the Maidan in Kiev, defending the Ukrainian cause and defending against Russian aggression, we agree in many, many respects and regards. In some regards, I do not share your point. For instance, I do not believe that there is a climate change, man-made climate change, and I rather think this is a part of an apocalyptic scenario, which is part of a kind of creating a hysteric situation in the West. So, but with most points, I do agree. And I think the situation, especially in Germany, is very, very serious. And because there is a state of mind that there is no alternative. There is no alternative to realpolitik with Russia. And this, having no alternative, there is an alliance from the left to the right, from the former Chancellor of the Federal Republic up to the State Chancellery in Bavaria, from the AfD, which is visiting Donbass, going to Crimea, up to the left deputies in the Bundestag who are visiting regularly the president's administration.
Could you turn into a question, please? Just so.
Okay, the question is, no, I wanted to say that the situation is very serious, but that the notion of fascism does not help us to solve the analytical problems. I think that you use this term because the situation is very, very dramatic and serious, but we need new categories to describe the situation which evolved. And I would say, why fascism? It's the Russian tradition of Stalinism. Why do we not talk about the traditional lines of Stalinism? Why not about the Black Hundred tradition in Russia, etc.? So we do not need the analogies and the trap of analogies with fascism. We need new categories to enter a postmodernist dictatorship, which is Putin. And we will not defend our social and political order if we are not able to create a new terminology and a new categories.
Our time is short. Could you please turn it into a question?
Yeah. The question is that I'm not satisfied with these analogies to fascism, and that
That's not a question, sir. Please put a question.
Okay, I got it.
The question is,
okay.
I do not look for the future, I look for the present time, and for instance, for the heroic work of the New York Times, which is defending truth, the old-fashioned truth which is existing. And I do not need the superstructure of the philosophical superstructure.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Yeah. I mean, I think we all need different things, but I agree with you that factuality is among the most important things, and I agree with you that an analysis of Russia, which is not what this talk was about, although we've gotten into it, an analysis of Russia today would have to include things that go well beyond familiar political categories. It would include apparent banalities like the death of local news. One of the ways that the Russian Federation was ahead of the curve of the United States and Europe is that local news died first. And when local news dies, people begin to lose trust for journalism, and they start to talk about the media, and they become more vulnerable to conspiracy theorizing, not just of their own government, but in general. In the United States, local news died essentially after 2008. That's a mistake that I urge you not to repeat. So I agree with you about the New York Times, and I would add the Washington Post and the Guardian and the BuzzFeed did some very important work. I would say old-fashioned investigation. I mean, the book that I was talking about a bit tonight is dedicated to journalists as the heroes of our times, which I deeply, deeply believe. The internet is largely about retransmission. If you read a news story on the internet, it's almost certainly the work of some other person, and it's just being retransmitted in some way or another. There are only a couple thousand actual investigative journalists left in the world, and they're doing precious work. Without them, we don't have the Panama Papers, we don't have the Paradise Papers, we don't know the extent of offshoring, we don't understand the degree of wealth inequality in the world, we don't have a clue about the Americans in Iraq or the Russians in Ukraine, without those couple thousand people. So that is an institution which we absolutely have to support as against old-fashioned things like Stalinism and fascism, but also as against the postmodern things which I am trying to describe. I mean, the politics of eternity is a new term for what I think is a new phenomenon, and it's a new kind of assault on truth.
Let's take one more. See the guy with his hand up there? Go straight back. The gentleman should have his hand up. There he goes.
Thanks so much. My name's Hugh Williamson. I work for Human Rights Watch here in Berlin. I'm going to be the third person who deals with your use of the word fascism.
Believe me, you're not the third.
No, I mean, in this audience, I mean, I'm interested in your reflections on it as a public intellectual of using this word. Obviously, you've irritated some people in this audience in your use of it, and I'm interested in your... I can fully understand your use of it because you're a renowned historian of fascism, but you're a conscious and clever public intellectual. And what is your reflection on the controversies you evidently stir by using this term?
Can you be a little more clear? What does that mean?
I mean, yeah, like the two other speakers have suggested, it maybe it's not the best use of the...
What does maybe it's not the best use mean? Help me out. I mean, that you're irritated, okay, but like tell me what is it exactly that irritates you? Because fascism is a real thing in the world. It's a real thing in history, right? It's a real concept, which plenty of people have discussed. What exactly is it that's on your mind? Because I want to talk to you.
I think it's probably probably maybe because we're speaking in Germany and that it relativizes the terrors and the horrors of fascism.
Speaking of fascism relativizes fascism?
I mean, don't throw it back to me. I'm asking you a question. Yeah.
But I mean, what is it?
No, but let me just say two things. I mean, you did make a point that you said at one point, you know, if it's not fascism, then it's okay. The sort of flipping back you referred to. I found that insightful because if you hadn't used the word fascism, then people may be concerned about the issues of that you're referring to as not fascists as Trump and Orban presumably and Putin and so on in a more considered and concerned way because they're not you'd recognise they're not fascists, so they're nevertheless they're authoritarian or they're problematic in severe and serious ways. And secondly, I'm interested in your use of the example that you can't control others in using fascism, like you mentioned Bannon and Putin, in that surely you said at the beginning and a theme of your talk is to be thoughtful about the use of language, and surely we should be thoughtful in the use of language and not use fascism because others are using the term.
Okay. So let me start from there and try to clear it up. I'm not using fascism because Steve Bannon cites fascists. That's a fundamental misunderstanding. I have to use the word fascism when a fascist reads a fascist book and draws fascist conclusions in the public sphere. I have to use the word fascism to describe it. That doesn't mean it's the only thing happening in the world or in the world of politics, but I don't think it does any service to the memory or the history of fascism to ignore it when it is in fact present, which it is. It's not the only thing which is present, but it is certainly present. And I don't think it does any service to the history of fascism to imagine that every time the subject comes up, we're somehow relativizing in the bad, which is somehow a bad thing, always relativizing. We're relativizing in the bad sense of the word the history of National Socialism. On the contrary, I think it's very important that we return again and again to the history of National Socialism because our own memory of it and our own image of it is constantly becoming more abstract and hollowing itself out and adapting itself to the convenient purposes of the day. We have to return again and again to the sources and again to the experience because those things allow us to see things, sometimes in our own present world, which we might not like to see. And the history of fascism, of course, also includes all of the people who might not have been fascist themselves, but were in some way drawn along by something, like a chant, right? Who were in some way drawn along by something, like a lie of a certain scale. The history of fascism is there to help us enlighten the present. Klemperer wasn't writing for the people of his own time. Klemperer was writing for us. Klemperer wasn't writing because he thought National Socialism would literally repeat itself. Klemperer was writing because he wanted Germans and others in the future to be aware of certain symptoms, not in the outside world so much as inside themselves. So you ask what I think about this as a historian, as one who wants to be careful with words. What I think is we shouldn't do things because other people do them. We should do things because we're searching for the truth. The question, what about this is fascist and what isn't, is a legitimate question. And it was a question, by the way, which was asked of me, and that's why I'm answering it here in front of you, right? But I think it's a legitimate question, and I'm not going to question the German institutions that asked me to talk about it in Germany, because I think it's an absolutely authorized question. But as a historian, what I think is that it's a mistake to fall into a culture of memory, where our response to words like Stalinism and fascism is to be irritated one way or the other. The history of fascism is not a point. It's not an on-off switch. The history of fascism is something which starts before 1933 and continues afterwards. Even in the best, in Germany today, even in its best moments, one sees certain echoes of the history of fascism. Just as in America today, in its best moments, we see echoes of the history of the 1930s. It doesn't take a president who says America first, which was an isolationist slogan propagated by, among other people, American fascists. It doesn't take a president who says America first to remind us that these histories go on. That we agree or disagree about how much is present, that's fine, and that's good. It would be a bad thing if we all agreed. But as a historian, and I thank you for this question because it really goes to the heart of one of the arguments I want to make. As a historian, I think that the way we think about time is what enables us to be active in politics. This goes back to some of the earlier questions. If we think in terms of a politics of inevitability, which says these labels, whether it's fascism or Stalinism, are part of something which no longer is with us because we're in this realm where it's how we feel or how we're offended and so on. Those are the things that matter. If we're in that politics of inevitability, it's very hard to get to the future. What history says is that things like fascism and Stalinism and all kinds of other forms of authoritarianism are in the European and in the world past, and that they present us with certain models and filters. They present us with certain sets of facts, which we can helpfully use to diagnose what we've got today and also what we can do about it today, right? Because in this exercise, which I'm by far not the only person to take it up, it's a long tradition which includes, for example, Hannah Arendt, the idea that you can use the history of fascism to diagnose the weaknesses and the vulnerabilities of democracy, right? This is an idea which helps us think our way into the future, because if we can't diagnose the weaknesses and the vulnerabilities with some set of skills or others, we also can't think our way into the future. And that's the way that I try to think about this as a historian who's being asked to answer questions in the public sphere, right? This talk was not about the history of fascism, but your question is perfectly well authorized, because why should we talk about these terms, right? And we shouldn't talk about them just because they're terms that we like or we don't like. I don't like being called a fascist, right? Nobody likes being called a fascist. Few people like talking about fascism. But nevertheless, these are terms which do open up a certain kind of reality which we still have in us and which we're capable of seeing around us and which we can do more or less about. And also as a point of comparison, it helps us to see what's there and what's not. But the last thing I wanted to say is that for Klemper and for Arendt, or for that matter on the other side, for Havel, the reason why they were, going back to language, the reason why they're noticing things about language is not because fascism and Stalinism are set pieces which begin and end. It's because they reveal certain vulnerabilities about individuals in politics, which is my own primary concern. And whether or not we decide that the Trump administration has something to do with fascism, there are certain vulnerabilities that we have for certain kinds of things the fascists did, which might help us to see what our vulnerabilities now are. And so I think the more history we bring to bear on this, the better, because the more history we bring to bear on it, the better chance we have of not being surprised and of diagnosing things and dealing with them in time so that we can start thinking about the future.
Well, Tim, I would say that the weightiness and the seriousness of this discussion only underlines the weightiness and the seriousness of these issues. These are not simple things, and otherwise our discussion would be that simple. So I thank you so much for this tonight. The books are very light.